to this event. Thank you so much, mayoral candidates, for making this a priority. We also welcome the Chicago chapter of the National Association of Black Journalists. Thank you so much for your mission and your long history of advocating for and promoting journalists of color. We, like many citizens in the Chicago area, believe that an informed electorate is an empowered electorate, and so we thank you so much for being here this evening. I would now like to welcome and introduce Maudlin, who is our columnist for Chicago Chronicles here at the Chicago Sun-Times, and she's also the president of the Chicago chapter of the National Association of Black Journalists. Thank you.
Thank you, Nakia. The National Association of Black Journalists extends its thanks to the Chicago Sun-Times interim CEO, Ms. Nakia Wright, to Chicago Sun-Times editor-in-chief, Mr. Chris Fusco, and to all of these candidates for mayor of the city of Chicago for participation in tonight's forum. We thank, too, our esteemed members on the panel, Derek Blakely, Cheryl Corley, and Eric Johnson, who are representative of the best of NABJ Chicago. As you may know, NABJCC is a 43-year-old 501c3 organization, the local chapter of the largest organization of journalists of color in the nation. Our membership includes African-American journalists working at print, broadcast, and digital outlets throughout the Chicago metropolitan area, as well as related media and communications professionals. We offer associate memberships to journalism educators and J-School students from colleges throughout the metropolitan area. You should know that the core mission of the National Association of Black Journalists is to increase diversity in the nation's newsrooms and consequent coverage of minority communities throughout the nation. Here in Chicago, we do this through ongoing mentoring programs like our NABJ Roadshow, partnering with Chicago Public Schools, area universities, and community organizations across the South and West Sides to identify and encourage minority youth interested in journalism careers. And through the $3,000 to $5,000 in scholarships we award annually to college journalism students. Our monthly meetings offer a newsmaker panel, speaker presentations, professional development, and cultural exposure, with forums sensitizing media to the importance of fairness and diversity in newsrooms, to the need to expand diversity in newsroom management, and to promote balanced coverage of minority communities. NABJ Chicago remains committed to giving back to the Chicago community and to carrying out NABJ's mission through programs like our annual job fair with the National Association of Hispanic Journalists and through political forums such as this, which highlight the issues, substantive issues, confronting Black and brown communities throughout Chicago. That said, let the forum begin. Ladies and gentlemen, our moderator, the Chicago Sun-Times venerable award-winning columnist and one of NABJ Chicago's most longtime and esteemed members, Ms. Mary Mitchell.
Thank you, Marlon. Good evening.
Good evening.
So, the mayoral candidates are seated in alphabetical order. They are Dorothy Brown, Gary Chico, Bill Daley, Amara Inya, Lori Lightfoot, Gary McCarthy, Susan Mendoza, Tony Preckwinkle, Paul Vallis, and Willie Wilson. Our panelists are Derek Blakely, political reporter for CBS 2, Cheryl Corley, correspondent for NPR, Eric Johnson, city editor for the Chicago Crusader. Welcome, candidates and panelists. It was difficult to narrow down the number of invited candidates from such a large field. Know that the tough decisions were made. Because of the large number of candidates, we must adhere to strict time constraints if we are to provide our audience with meaningful insight to help them understand where candidates stand on issues relevant to Chicago's Black and brown communities. So here are the rules. There will be no opening statement. However, each candidate will have an opportunity to provide a 1-minute wrap-up. In order for each candidate to have a fair chance to present their views to the community, we must limit each candidate to a 1-minute response to each question. In fact, we have a timekeeper. Please meet Brandon Pope. Thank you, Brandon. And if you don't pay attention to Brandon, I will politely cut you off. There will be no interrupting each other or back and forth between candidates. Remember, this is a forum, not a debate. Let's respect each other. Panelists, you are responsible for monitoring candidates' adherence to your questions. So feel free to stop candidates if they're not answering the question and they start the filibuster. Also be advised that should you feel the need for a follow-up question in response to a candidate's answer, it will replace one of your 3 questions. Does everybody agree to these rules? Yes. Okay. All right. So, Derek, you have the honor of asking the first question.
Thank you very much, Mary. And I'd like to begin with a question regarding police reform, a question that's particularly germane given the events at 26th in California today. One of the incomplete parts of Mayor Emanuel's police reform plan is a citizen oversight board. The question, do you support a citizen oversight board, and should it have the power to help select or remove the superintendent and the power to set policy as well?
We want to start with Dorothy Brown.
I am undecided as it relates to a citizen oversight board, but my plan is to bring in a law enforcement panel of experts to help me overhaul the Chicago Police Department in its entirety, including COPA, looking at the policies that are followed by the Chicago Police Board, dealing with the superintendent, dealing with the how many districts we have, the proportionality between the police officers and the supervisors, the 21st century techniques that, if they're using 21st century techniques for investigating, especially the detectives. And so I'm going to overhaul the entire police department and make all decisions as it relates to a citizen oversight review board as mayor. That would be included in my plan to reform the Chicago Police Department in its entirety, as well as making sure that we implement the consent decree. I won't wait for a federal judge to actually rule on the consent decree. I will actually make sure there's accountability, make sure that
we need you to wrap it up.
Yes, make sure that there's accountability, community policing, health and wellness of police officers, all those things that they talked about within the consent decree.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chico.
I think there's a role for a citizen board, but let's face it, there's a lot of moving parts here. I've called for the Mayor's Office of Violence Reduction and Prevention. I believe that there will be other reforms in place called for in the consent decree, so we're going to have a lot of moving parts. I do not agree that a citizen board should choose or recommend the police superintendent. I think that the mayor of Chicago should have that responsibility. It's one of the most solemn responsibilities I see in the mayor's office, and that's to protect our citizens. And I think that the mayor should be fully and directly accountable for that choice and have the ability on his or her own volition to remove that person. I've called for the removal of Eddie Johnson because I think that the department has failed on a number of key fronts, and I think that the mayor ought to have that power to appoint and remove the Chicago Police Department superintendent.
Thank you. Mr. Daly.
I don't think that there ought to be a citizen oversight. I believe the superintendent is the one responsible, and I agree with Gary that he or she reports to the mayor, and the mayor must be held accountable for what goes on in the police department. Pardon me. There's going to be even more oversight that has existed in the past. Again, pardon me, with the consent decree. Federal judge and the monitors will be overseeing this. It will be very costly for the city, and I think we've got to get on with that. We've got to get on with improving the police department, but the mayor is the ultimate responsible person for what goes on in the police department and regarding crime in the city. So I think the mayor must reach out more to the community, no doubt about it. Our police department's got to be more involved in our communities and the community with the police department. But I think the oversight has got to be more streamlined by the mayor and keep him or her responsible for that leadership and any changes that need to be made in the police department.
Thank you. Ms. Enya.
I support the idea of community oversight of the police, and in fact, there were a couple of proposals that were set forth last year, one being CPAC and the other being GAPA. In both cases, community members came together for more than a year and worked to put together what the structure of those oversight bodies should be. I think we take into account what the work that was done and actually should move forward with considering either of those requests. Both were stalled because of what's happening in City Council and perhaps because of elections, but I think a lot of groundwork has already been done in structuring what oversight could look like, and it requires leadership from the mayor to craft a police department that is both responsive to the residents of Chicago as well as accountable to the mayor.
Thank you. Ms. Lightfoot.
Yes, I support civilian oversight of the police department. This was one of the recommendations of the Police Accountability Task Force, which I chaired, and the GAPA proposal, that's the Grassroots Alliance for Police Accountability, picked up the suggestions and the framework that we put into the PATF report. I stood with GAPA back in April when they announced their ordinance, and the only reason it hasn't moved forward is because Rahm Emanuel tried to undercut it. The GAPA proposal is based upon the Los Angeles Police Commission. Los Angeles has had civilian oversight for decades. We shouldn't fear that in Chicago. Yes, they should be able to pick the superintendent. Yes, they should be able to set policy. That's exactly what the Police Commission in LA does. And when we've got a $2 billion budget, where the police department affects literally every aspect of life in the city, citizens should have a seat at the table.
Thank you. Mr. McCarthy.
3 words: accountability, authority, and partnership. That's what I want to talk about. Simple business practices have it that if an individual is accountable, they need to have authority to do the things that they have to do. And here in Chicago, quite frankly, I got caught in the middle of that situation. While I wasn't in charge of the discipline system of the department, I was accountable for the behavior of every officer in the department. If I wanted to suspend somebody for 30 days or more, right up to termination, I could only make a recommendation to the Civilian Oversight Board, the police board. And quite frankly, they didn't agree with me. Almost 3 out of 4 times said I wanted to terminate police officers from the department. Now, a compliment. That changed when Lori Lightfoot took over the police board. But without authority, we shouldn't be holding people accountable. So what we should be thinking about is partnership. Figure out a method to have partnership with the community and involvement, but I don't like oversight, limiting the authority of the superintendent.
Ms. Mendoza.
Sure. I think that there is an important role to play with citizen oversight as well as with the GAPA proposal. Without a doubt, we cannot get to a point where we are moving forward on building a better trusting relationship between the police and the community if we're not taking into account those concerns that most impact members of Black and brown communities. I mean, this cannot be driven solely from the mayor's office, solely through the prism of the police. It has to be not a situation of us versus them, but of we. So we have to get to a place where we are listening to the community. They have put a lot of work, their hearts and souls, into trying to bring forth those issues that are most concerning to them. Every Black mother in Chicago or a Hispanic mother in Chicago wants to make sure that their children are treated the exact same way when they leave their homes as children who don't look like them. And when we talk about stop and frisk and we talk about things like that, I mean, the reality of it is that Black and brown kids are being stopped and frisked way more.
We need you to wrap up.
Oh, I'm sorry. That went by quickly. Sorry.
That's okay.
But at the end of the day, there is a place for citizen oversight, but the mayor does have to be accountable for the department.
Ms. Preckwinkle.
Thank you.
Well, I think police reform has a number of components, and civilian oversight is one of them. I support the GAPA proposal, which is also supported by the Aldermanic Black Caucus. But I think there are other things we need to talk about in terms of police reform, implementing the consent decree, particularly focusing on increasing the professionalization of our police department, investing in their training, particularly their training around crisis intervention and de-escalation strategies, improving their supervision. You know, the national model is 1 sergeant for every 8 to 10 officers on the street. And in some of our districts, we have 1 sergeant for every 30 officers on the street. So we really have to improve that. I believe we need a criminal justice office in the mayor's office, similar to New York, that would focus on bringing stakeholders together, that would help distribute money for anti-violence initiatives, restorative justice initiatives, anti-recidivism initiatives. And I also think it's important that we focus on the effectiveness of our police department. You know, nationally, police,
We need you to wrap up.
we need to make our police department as effective as it can possibly be.
Thank you very much. Mr. Vallis.
Well, thank you. I believe in professional oversight. I think all boards should be hybrid and that they should have community civilian representation. Obviously, we have a consent decree, and that consent decree is going to bring a certain degree of accountability. We need to make sure, though, that the consent decree itself doesn't become a cottage industry and that the consent decree does not distract from police time. I also think we need to rebuild the police department because the police department has been significantly degraded, and that means we've got to restore the concept of beat integrity. That means you have to support units, so your strategy is just not to move police from one community to another, and that we have the infrastructure of accountability, which means the sergeant ratios, the training officer ratios, and redundant training. And finally, I believe that the next generation of police officers can come from the community because we have 10,000 students in RLTC programs, and 90% of them are Black and Latino, and they can provide a pipeline for the next generation of all first responders. You want to transform the police department, build a police department that reflects in greater ways the community at large.
Thank you very much. Mr. Wilson.
I see a little bit different. I believe that we need equality to reflect the police department and job, contracts, all the way down. I believe that the politician is the one need to be investigated first. All right, and when I say that is because a lot of politicians up here tonight been part of Ron Emanuel cover-up. They haven't said nothing, any complaint or nothing. So I find them as a cover-up too. I would like the state's attorney to open an investigation on the politicians, some of them set up here tonight, and those who are not here tonight as well.
Okay. Is there any follow-up? Anybody ready to trade a question for a follow-up? If not, we're going to. No? Okay. So we'll move on to Ms. Corley.
And we don't want to lose out on those questions. I would suspect that all of you are students of Chicago history and know well the slogans of Chicago, and one of them is that this is a city of neighborhoods. But of course, our neighborhoods aren't exactly the same all across the city. Structural racism, discrimination has played a big part in how those neighborhoods look. So I want to know what steps that you would take as mayor to create more equitable neighborhoods in the city of Chicago, especially when it comes to perhaps providing affordable housing in all sections of the city. And I also want to know if you would focus on making our neighborhoods more integrated racially, economically, and how you would do that.
Okay. In the interest of fairness, we are going to start at the end of the alphabet. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you. I believe that we must make sure all 7 communities in Chicago with equality, jobs, and contracts. And I think that what we have to take and do is making sure that we put the dollars within the community, not adding more police to the community, but put the resources in the community, like jobs and contract. Take that $8.5 billion that they put in O'Hare, let's take $1 billion or $2 billion of that and put it into our neighborhood. All right? Let's reflect what Chicago really is and what it should be at least, and that is to make sure that people who's in position today, that being people of color from those neighborhoods, is still not doing right. They're African American, they're Latina, they're not white, but they're doing wrong to the community. So we got to eat all them jokers the same way.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Vallis.
All right, very quickly, when I ran the Chicago Public Schools, I actually made community disbursement of resources a priority. Classic example, MBWB, 58% of those hired on school construction programs, $1.8 billion, were Black and Latino, 54% were African American and Latino businesses. That's because I took all the construction programs out of Public Building Commission. And when they built Northside College Prep, I put a magnet high school in every region, including Gwendolyn Brooks, right across the street from where I grew up. And I put magnet programs in neighborhood high schools, I think 18 of them. But look, I've laid out a strategy to take full advantage of the opportunity zones, divert a third of all TIF money
into an equity investment fund for the south sides and west sides, and then to take the $20 billion budget and revenues that the city controls and to allocate those revenues and those resources the way I allocated the school construction resources when I was head of the Chicago Public Schools. Those three things alone would significantly revitalize these communities that have been long neglected.
Thank you. Ms. Perkwinkle.
You know, I think this is a social justice and equity issue. I always begin my remarks by talking about the importance of having strong neighborhood schools. And we have wonderful schools in some of our communities, but access to quality education isn't available in all of our communities. And we have to have, in order to have vital neighborhoods, we have to have strong neighborhood public schools in all of our communities. When I was alderman of the 4th Ward, you know, we built 1,500 units of housing, most of it affordable rental, some of it mixed income, some of it market rate. We have to invest in communities that have been struggling over time with demolition, with depopulation, with gangs. And we need to look at the Affordable Requirements Ordinance, which provides resources for housing in our communities. The general consensus is that it's not providing family units, which are so desperately needed. We also have to look at opportunities for employment. We can't have strong neighborhoods if people do not have employment. And we need to connect communities with large numbers of unemployed or underemployed people with the industries that are growing in our economy. And we also need to help entrepreneurs.
Thank you so much. We need to wrap up. Yes, Ms. Mendoza.
Thank you. Well, number one, we have to acknowledge that we have a broken and rigged property tax system that has locked people on the west and south side of the city of Chicago in a cycle of poverty. The issue of affordable housing is critically important, but we have to make sure that every neighborhood in the city of Chicago has access to affordable housing, but that the development that occurs happens without displacement. Our community school concept that I put forth in my Future Now plan, our 50 New initiative, is critical to, I think, investing in the infrastructure, human capital infrastructure that we need to revitalize these neighborhoods, provide a longer school day in a safe environment in the 50 most underutilized and under-resourced schools that would allow kids to be in a safe environment, getting access to supper and after-school programs while their parents get access to job placement services, job training services. And because, frankly, we have to start training people for the jobs of tomorrow today. Vocational programs have to be a must in many of these neighborhoods.
Thank you so much. Yes. All right, Mr. McCarthy. I'm still listening for the word segregation.
I actually used a timer, sorry.
You're going to hear it right now.
Okay, thank you.
You're going to hear it right now because the first step towards creating equity is to recognize and acknowledge the fact that this was done on purpose through segregation and redlining. The first step to recognition has to do with the articulation of it. We have to have a difficult discussion about race and the history of African Americans and people of color in this country and certainly here in this city. We need to use TIF funding according to the law, which is blighted neighborhoods, but for the TIF funding, they would remain blighted, not places like Block 37. I support neighborhood and vocational schools because we need to teach people to fish, not give them a fish. We need transparency in the way contracts are given out. And the last thing we need is affordable housing. And through the vocational schools and giving tax incentives to small businesses to go to those neighborhoods, we can assume some of those abandoned properties, rehab them, and create affordable housing all at the same time.
Thank you. Ms. Lightfoot.
So, Cheryl, you know you've asked a very big question, and you've heard some responses that I agree with, but let me focus in on, I think, the heart of your question, which is affordable housing and segregation. Look, fundamentally, we have to deal with the affordable housing crisis. Depending on who you talk to, we're down at least 120,000 affordable units. There's 3/4 of the city for which, over the last 15 years, not a single affordable housing unit has been built. Why is that? Because the city hasn't led. The city makes it very difficult to build affordable housing units. The city has allowed developers to pay in lieu of fees instead of building. And the city has allowed automatic prerogative to kill housing projects that need to happen. So we have to address those things. We need to make sure that the city works for community-based housing developers and lower the red tape for them. We need to get rid of automatic prerogative. We need to make sure that the Affordable Requirements Ordinance, more units are built on site, particularly for families. That's a problem. So there's more to say, obviously.
The problem with segregation is that it allows the power structure, city government in this instance, to determine who is valued and who is not, which populations are valued and which are not. Black and brown neighborhoods in Chicago have been devalued, and therefore they have not been invested in financially. The first step is to change the paradigm for how we invest in our neighborhoods by directing investment to neighborhoods that have been overlooked for decades. We also have to be much more creative about the economic development tools at our disposal and think outside the box, beyond TIFs, thinking about models that build generational wealth, which is the foundation of building strong communities. That means removing barriers to pathways to ownership. We have to make sure that we have financing that is allowable for entrepreneurs, especially entrepreneurs in marginalized communities, to open up their own businesses. We have to prioritize community benefits agreements because they provide a say in development projects. We have to address housing and making sure that housing is not limited to only a select few communities in the city. These are the things that foundationally will begin to turn the tide on segregation in Chicago.
Thank you so much, Mr. Daly.
There's no doubt we need more affordable housing in every neighborhood in this city. Over the last 40 years, Chicago has lost 400,000 African Americans. Basically, the middle class, which Chicago was the envy of black middle class in America, and that change began in the 80s. Now, one of the main reasons, let's be honest, was African Americans could not move to the suburbs till the early 80s. It wasn't the 60s, wasn't the 70s, it was truly not to the early 80s. And when they had the opportunity, like everybody else, they thought the American dream was to get out and go. And others left for the good reasons. Crime, schools, the reasons they left were multiple. And we've got to change that. We've got to turn that around. We've got to get our population back up. We've got to make neighborhoods safer, stronger, more affordable, so that black middle class and strengthens in this city, because without a stronger African-American middle class in Chicago, this city will never reach its potential.
Thank you.
There's
Mr.
no doubt
Chico.
there's segregation in Chicago, but it doesn't have to be that way. I've spent the greater part of my career trying to integrate parts of Chicago. I was an attorney to the control receiver and went out into neighborhoods that historically have had no CHA housing and put them in those neighborhoods. I worked on behalf of developers at the Flannery Homes to build 80 townhouses, of which 20 were for CHA residents, the rest were market. I worked on a development just north of the old Cabrini Green, where we had 3 flats, and we made sure that that was economically integrated and racially integrated. This can be done. I'm fresh off of a project just north of Sinai Hospital to build 400 units of affordable housing, 150,000 square feet of office, and 15,000 square feet of retail. It's not just about housing. It's about jobs, it's about retail, and it's about office jobs. We need to bring all of that to our communities.
Thank you. Ms. Brown.
Well, Chicago is a tale of two cities. Some places are flourishing and some places are not. It has a lot to do with the fact that we have permitted the ward-level approach for economic development. Our aldermen make the decisions. And I have proposed a plan, a comprehensive economic and community development plan that goes to 8 planning districts and actually have experts putting together that plan. Within that plan would be the housing, affordable housing. And I'm going to have a housing czar that will actually look at affordable housing, making sure that we get away from the affordable requirements, opt-out options that are in the affordable requirements ordinance that permit developers to not have affordable housing within their development. That has dealt with, that's one of the reasons why we can't have integration. I want Section 8 and voucher programs to be anywhere within the city of Chicago. Many aldermen have actually worked towards not being able to have that within their areas, and I want to do that.
Thank you very much. Any debate back here? You guys are satisfied? Okay, well, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Johnson.
Thank you. My question is in the area of mental health. It's a problem that has been growing over the years. As mayoral candidates for Chicago, do you plan to reopen the 7 mental health clinics that Mayor Rahm Emanuel closed in 2012?
We want to start that question and give that question to Mr. Chico.
Sure. I've already called for the restoration of the funding to reopen those mental health facilities by eliminating waste in city government. 7 years ago, thereabout, the mayor created the Infrastructure Trust, which was supposed to be an innovative way to draw capital to build bridges, highways, and other projects. It hasn't built anything in 7 years. It's $2 million a year to fund the staff of that agency. I've called for its elimination and to repurpose all $2 million to opening up the mental health facilities that were closed years ago. Look, it is abundantly clear if you walk around this city, you see people who are desperate for assistance. And we cannot turn a blind eye to the people's plight. And we have to find all kinds of ways to bring the resources necessary to provide those services conveniently to our citizens.
Thank you. Mr. Daly.
No doubt the goal is to reopen all of them. We celebrate, and Tony Preckwinkle has talked about the depopulation of the jail. I think Tom Dart said 20 to 30% of the people who are in the jail have mental issues. It was the largest psychiatric facility in America, in his opinion. And so we have celebrate the fact that we have brought that population down, but how many of those people are out on the street with true mental problems? And we've got to help them. The only way we can do that is if we have the facilities to help them in neighborhoods where people live, where they reside, and where they need the help. So I'm in favor of it. We'll find the money. One way or the other, we have to find the money for this city.
But do you have any idea where you would find the money?
I think there's, look, in a budget of $10 billion, trust me, this is not that much money.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Enya.
So it's not enough just to reopen the facilities. What the city did when they attempted to save about $2 million and close those facilities was they dismantled the mental health infrastructure for the city as they were divesting from this as a city service. So you have to rebuild the entire mental health infrastructure. Yes, to the clinics, but also there's a level of education in communities to make sure that people know that these services are available to them. The city also has a responsibility to work with social service organizations that are at the front lines of this work in neighborhoods to ensure that they have the resources that they need to sustain themselves and to serve their patients, and also making sure that we are advocating for health care generally across the board so that people know that they can access this. Beyond that, we need mental health services in our schools. Our children are dealing with trauma as well and exposure to many things that affect their mental health. So we have to have licensed counselors in schools and make sure that schools are working closely with organizations in the community that provide mental health services.
Thank you. Ms. Lightfoot.
Of course, we should reopen the clinics, but we have to go much further than that. As Amara just said, we have to focus on building a mental health infrastructure here in the city. There's lots of different service providers that frankly did and do a better job of delivering services to people that are in need than the clinics did. The clinics focus on the most extreme cases, but there's lots of people who are suffering from trauma that wouldn't be eligible to provide those services. If you look at the budget of the Public Health Department, it's a pittance. It is reliant almost solely on grant funding and not corporate dollars. So we have to reprioritize the importance of mental health. We also, frankly, I think the city has a role in helping destigmatize mental illness. A lot of families have this issue, either family members or close family members. So we've got to make sure that we are doing everything we can to provide services and support for them. Of course, we need to have a trauma-informed public school curriculum as well.
Thank you. Mr. McCarthy, and do you think you can work in your answer how this is going to be paid for? These are all great, everybody's saying great things, but how is it going to be paid for?
Okay. So first of all, I don't think that opening the mental health facilities goes far enough. Back in the end of August, we released our school plan, and my vision for community neighborhood schools has it that those locations will be hubs for the community, not just a place where we send our kids for 8 hours a day, and two-tiered social services right into the schools for the community, not just for the student and the family, wraparound services right there. The funding exists in our budgets. The Tiff reform that we're proposing has it that we can use a lot of that surplus for a lot of different things, but just to put those places back on the map is not that expensive. It's a couple of $1 million a year, and quite honestly, in a $9 billion budget, we can find the room, but we have to make decisions based upon need, not based upon politics, not based upon what's good for me, but what's good for the community.
Thank you. Ms. Mendoza.
Yes. Clearly, I think that we do need to reopen the mental health clinics, but that's not enough. I mean, a lot of people touched on this, but there's also the need to destigmatize it, because many people are not going to walk into a mental health clinic because they don't want people to know that they might be going through a problem. So we need to not just bring back the health clinics to deal with the worst cases, and not the mental health clinics, but also provide those type of funding mechanisms in traditional settings of care. If you break your arm, you go to the hospital, nobody asks you anything. You should be able to walk into any traditional care facility and have access to whatever services you may need, including mental health services. and again, as well in our schools, where our kids are living with trauma every day, paying for it. Marijuana revenues should go towards mental health clinics. And I would argue, Mary, that we're already paying for it, much more costly than if we actually provided services in health treatment centers, because the alternative to not doing that means we're paying way more to incarcerate people who should be treated, and we're paying way more in emergency room service.
Thank you.
Sure.
Ms. Pergwinkle.
You know, I think this is a social justice challenge that the city faces. The closure of those 7 clinics was sold as a cost-saving measure, but it really was cost-shifting. You know, our Cook County Health and Hospital System saw an increase in people in our emergency room in crisis because they didn't get their meds and their therapy. And we also saw more people in the Cook County Jail who were struggling with behavioral health challenges, acting out as a result of their lack of treatment options. So when we formed our Cook County Medicaid expansion program called County Care, we included a behavioral health component to provide treatment options for people for substance abuse, for addiction, for behavioral health needs. And, you know, I think it's important that the City of Chicago not only reopen clinics, but work more closely with the Cook County Health and Hospital System and the community-based organizations that picked up the slack when the city closed those clinics.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to move to Mr. Vallis.
Great. Mary, you know, we used to have 19 clinics, not just the 12, and now we're down to 6. So let me point out that I think we should have a clinic in every police district, period. And then the clinics can work with the schools and with the police department on a whole array of services. And it can actually get funded through both institutions. So having having mental health and wellness services in the community that are community-owned can make a difference. Now, I've talked about funding these things. Obviously, you can always talk about changing the priorities, and we may get a we'll reprioritize answer on just about everything. But you can also look at earmarking a portion of the income, property tax towards the funding of local mental health centers, just as these local referendums have done with the 0.25% levies that they've been passing with local referendums. But I have also recommended that we earmark the cannabis revenues to rebuild social service infrastructure like mental health, like opioid and drug addiction, like legal aid services, period.
All right, thank you. And Mr. Wilson.
Yeah, I think you got to open them up in the community, in your churches, because people come to churches for help. You could create economic empowerment within the community at the same time. Most people do not have car fare to get to 7 clinic because they're not within their neighborhood. So, but if you go to church in those neighborhoods, you can go right there and get help, right into the church. How are you going to pay for it? The budget is somewhere around about $10 billion, roughly, for the city of Chicago. $7 billion of that is payroll. I'm running business, you'd be out of business with 60% of your payroll right away. You take some of those dollars and manage it the right way, and you go that route into the churches and to the community.
Okay, thank you. And Ms. Brown.
So people that suffer from mental health, they're our most vulnerable citizens, and I think that closing these, balancing the budget on their back is absolutely the wrong thing to do. But, you know, back in the 90s is when the federal government started defunding mental health, and then that just kind of had a ripple effect into the city of Chicago. And I want to, so we need to deal with our congresspeople to get that refunded. Then we have to call the governor, because that's a pass-through from the federal government through the state to the city to not only reopen those clinics that have been closed, but also to increase the number of clinics. We have a homeless population that deals with mental health every day. And so we need to make sure that not only do we reopen those clinics, but we deal with those areas that are dealing with the homeless that have the wraparound services to help them. And then I sat on the board of an organization that dealt with mental health. And so we have to fund those organizations as well.
Thank you. Any follow-up?
We're going to leave that up to you, Mary.
Okay. All right, Derek.
Thank you, Mary. As all you know, unless we get the city's pension situation straightened out, we won't have much money to pay for much of anything. By 2023, Chicago is going to need $2 billion in required contributions for 4 pension funds, up from about $1.2 billion next year. So the question is, how would you meet that obligation, and do you support Mayor Emanuel's plan to borrow $10 billion to pay off that pension debt? I know you've been asked this before. at the Tribune editorial board, they said that you all dropped the ball and gave vague answers, so we want to give you another
Not all of
chance.
us. That was the first two panels, not today, dear.
Okay, all right, well, we'll start with Mr. Daly, and then we'll work from Mr. Daly all the way down this way.
Sure. No doubt about it, the long-term economic future of the city is dependent on solving this problem. We have about 50,000 retirees and 35,000 present employees of the city. That's 85,000 people, about 3% of the population of Chicago, and it is a $26 billion anchor around the future of this city. I'm the only one who I believe has said that I believe the Constitution has to be changed so we can have honest negotiations. This should not be on the backs of the retirees that need to address this. On the other hand, it should not just be on the backs of the taxpayers. We have all laid out a series of things on revenue, which we all talk about, and that's important. But we also have to address the long-term problem, and the only way to do that is to have honest negotiations with labor. And I've said this to the CFL and to labor leaders I've met. That is the only way we can go forward. We can solve the short-term problems or address them, but the long-term problems is impossible unless we change the Constitution.
Thank you, Ms. Sinya.
In the short term, there are a number of things we can do to plug that gap that we have with regard to pensions. One is the city can actually be much more aggressive in attacking and addressing the underassessment of large commercial real estate downtown. We do not do that. That is the source of potentially hundreds of millions of dollars over time. Two, we should actually be clawing back public funds from corporations who receive public dollars but have not lived up to their redevelopment agreements. Three, we actually have to assess the status of existing contracts to make sure we're actually getting our value add on those contracts, and if we are not, we need to end those contracts. Secondly, we have to actually address the current waste and corruption that's costing us in police misconduct, $1.7 billion, in other areas of government, hundreds of millions of dollars that we would otherwise have in our economy. Moving forward, we have to have a growth strategy for revenue, which includes having a Bank of Chicago that would eliminate toxic swap deals that cost us hundreds of millions, but also recirculate revenue back into our economy and allow us to expand the small business sector.
We need to wrap up. And Ms. Lightfoot.
Let me address the specific questions. No, I do not support the pension obligation bond, in part because in typical Rahm Emanuel fashion, he hasn't rolled out the details. He hasn't told us specifics about what the interest rate is going to be, and it's risky. If we look at Detroit, we look at Stockton, those two cities were driven into bankruptcy in part because of the pension obligation bond, and we've tried it at the state level with disastrous results. There's no easy answer for pensions. It's been tried many times, but I believe, first, pensions are a promise. We cannot impair the retirement benefits of current employees and retirees. We obviously have to have a different conversation about people who are coming on city government starting in January 2020. We're going to have to obviously increase revenue. There's no way around that. But I think to build the case for revenue with the taxpayers, we have to demonstrate to them that we're going to be proper fiscal agents. We do that by eliminating settlements, judgments over time. We have to look at consolidating the administrative and investment functions of the four pension
Thank you very much. Mr. McCarthy.
The first step towards solving this is to have a freeze on new TIF fund spending, 1 year of freeze, which could reap us as much as $300 million for the general fund. Second, we can institute a payment in lieu of taxes for all nonprofits, which could give us up to $50 million a year. We need to demand our fair share of our sales tax from the state, which could give us up to $20 million a year. We need to expand gaming and support it here in the city of Chicago. We need to have a parking ticket amnesty, which the last time we did it reaped between $10 and $20 million. Finally, the crazy idea is to offer annexation to some of the column municipalities here in Chicago to build our tax base based upon the people that we've lost, now bring some more people in.
Thank you, Ms. Mendoza.
In reference to the bond deal, I think that it would be irresponsible to totally just throw it out the window without actually looking at the numbers. And to Lori's point, that is exactly what's wrong with the bond deal that we see now, is that we don't know any facts about it. What I do know is that as controller, I championed a bond deal that saved the taxpayers of Illinois between $4 and $6 billion over the 12-year course of that deal. We did it right, and we were super transparent as to what it was going to look like. I think that given the fact that we can't plug this 300 to 400 million hole with magic beans and pixie dust, right? And we can't wait for a casino to pass or marijuana to pass or a progressive income tax, which might take years. We've got to figure out, let's look at the bond deal, at least talk about it, be transparent as to maybe a short-term, a mid-term, or a long-term solution, and look at where the risk might be less than the reward that we get back. So we've got to find the sweet spot, but talking about it publicly and openly with the public, because they'll be on the hook for paying for it, is a key part of building trust in that.
Thank you.
I think it's important that we look at this challenge through an equity lens, and we're going to we're going to have to pursue a variety of options, and that there's no magic bullet. One of the things, obviously, we need to look at is Tiff reform. We're in a situation now where 31%, almost a third of our property tax revenues go into sequestered Tiff districts. That's not sustainable over the long run. And furthermore, the most valuable real estate in the city, our downtown area, is in Tiff districts, which are supposed to be used, TIFs are supposed to be used as catalysts for economic development. Surely we don't need them downtown. We need to look at workman's comp reform. When I came in to office at the county, we had a $487 million gap to close. And we said to every separately elected official, of whom there were 11, it's going to be shared sacrifice. And we made 15% cuts across the board and pursued a variety of other initiatives to close that gap. So it's possible. I think we have to have a long-term strategy for growing our Chicago economy.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Vallis.
Okay, let's remember that the pension obligation is a 4-year ramp. So basically what I've said is we need to do a combination of things. We need to protect the local government distributed fund and end the illegal diversion of corporate personal property replacement tax revenues. That in itself would generate $250 million. And we need, obviously, long-term funding equity when it comes to the old Chicago teachers' retirement pensions. But that in itself would cover half of the pension obligation, because remember, we're ramping up. Secondly, I've laid out a series of proposals. I focused on 10 areas of budget efficiencies. They include overtime, contractual services, payment in lieu of taxes, workers' compensation, healthcare reform. You know, I took a $1.4 billion 5-year structural deficit and turned it into $1 billion in cash balances when I was in the Chicago Public Schools. So believe me, I can find 5% savings over a period of 4 years. And then finally, you know, I've been a big critic of the pension obligation bond, but if we can use TIF money to fund the pension obligation bond or earmark freed up TIF money to the pension funds, that might be an option and a contingency. But I will not use cannabis or, for that matter, casino money to fund pensions. I'll use it for other things.
Mr. Wilson.
Well, as being in business, I would take some of the payroll dollars. If you're going, your payroll is going to be like 60 to 65%. Versus San Francisco, let's just say they're $4 billion, Chicago $7 billion, all right? Those dollars right there can help save these pension situations. The other thing, you got to lower taxes. If you lower taxes, you bring more people into the city. If you raise taxes, they go to Indiana, they go to Arkansas, they go to Texas. You got to lower taxes for business, so business stays in Chicago, and it's hired people to job. Economic empowerment that way would bring it down. And the other one you got to do, you got to investigate white-collar crime. That probably would do it by itself.
You think there's enough money in white-collar crime to pay the pensions?
It'll make a big hole in it.
Okay. All right. Dorothy Brown.
So not only do I want to deal with the pension crisis, but I also want to deal with the health insurance that has been taken away from retirees as well. And so I am saying that, because I think this is also a financial stability issue here. So I'm going to create a Revenue Opportunities Commission that will put together a long-term, 20-year financial stability plan for the city of Chicago. And I want to make sure that the fees that are already currently assessed, that they're properly being collected, that we have controls in place, that those are being collected. I want to look at the payment plans. People can't even have to pay 50% to get into a payment plan. Why can't you just get into a payment plan and start to pay? We'll collect a lot more money if we do that. I want to have amnesty programs. And then I have recommended a city-sponsored lottery that will actually be technology-based, where people could actually buy my lottery ticket anywhere in the world. And I want to look at the financial transaction tax. I want to put that back on the table as well.
Thank you. Mr. Chico.
First of all, we need to keep our heads about the problem. We've seen these kinds of problems before. Paul and I saw it at the Chicago Public Schools and turned what was a $1.4 billion deficit into a $400 million surplus. It can be done. I believe we have to raise revenue, cut waste, and I would keep the tool of pension obligation bonds if they're done responsibly, like they were in Wisconsin. If you get responsible bankers and you structure the transaction properly, you should be able to use it as a tool, and it could, in a hurry, stabilize our pension funds. We can raise the revenue through a city-owned casino. It doesn't have to take that long. We can get temporary license authority, put it right at McCormick Place for the first 2 years. Legalize marijuana doesn't have to take that long either. We already have a structure with medical. We need to tax million-dollar home sales and put that money into our treasury. And I've also said we have a corrupt property tax system that only assesses skyscrapers at 1/2 their value, meaning all of us have to pay in our neighborhoods. We need to cut waste. I've talked about the infrastructure trust.
Thank you.
I've suggested consolidating the clerk's
Thank
and
you,
treasurer's
Mr.
office
Chico.
right into the city government.
Thank you very much. We're going to throw it over to Cheryl Corley.
Mary, I have a lot of follow-up questions for you.
Oh, you
that
do?
I'll
Okay.
I'll funnel them to you, but I'm going to move ahead because somebody talked about the loss of population and how during the Great Migration we saw hundreds of thousands of Black Americans come to this city, love this city. Now 100,000 Black Americans are leaving this city and have kind of divided feelings about it. In addition to that loss, we're also seeing a loss of business in areas where people have decided to stay. There's been a lot of big news about Marshalls leaving, a lot of big news about Target leaving, where Target is actually building in other neighborhoods. So I want to know, Mayor Emanuel proposed and signed an executive order that would keep developers from using TIF money for retail projects if large tenants plan to close stores in another part of the city. And I was wondering if you all like that idea, if you would keep it intact, and how would you bring kind of brand name developers on stores back into these neighborhoods?
We want to start with Ms. Inya.
Yes, thank you. So one of the things that we have to do is, in addition to attracting those large big box retailers, we have to prioritize stabilizing the small business sector. We know that there can be a detrimental effect to small businesses in proximity to large big box retailers. So that has to be a part of the plan. We also need to have an early warning system in place whenever any public dollars are used so that a company can tell you up front what their plans are for locating in a particular site. What happened with the closure of the Targets and most recently Marshalls is that it was very abrupt and people were left scrambling. So working in an early warning system allows the community to then plan and the city to plan how they will fill that gap and how they can shore up the local economy. The other thing is making sure that we're adhering to the redevelopment agreement with public tax dollars. And what that means is we have to be able to claw back dollars when the corporation does not adhere to the stipulations that are laid out in the agreement. Everything from having an early warning system to shoring up the small businesses in proximity and then making sure that they alert city leadership with any large plans is necessary to make sure we're protecting our communities.
Thank you very much. Ms. Lightfoot?
Rahm Emanuel's executive order is not worth the paper that it was written on. If you look at the actual language of it, it focuses on the intent of the company at the time that it received public funds. No company is going to say, yes, I intended to screw the neighborhood and leave. The fact of the matter is our economic development strategy cannot be dependent upon luring big boxes into neighborhoods. Our economic development strategy should be focused on building wealth through small business development. There are 3 things that the city can do today to make that happen. Number 1, I know from my experience at the procurement department, breaking down city contracts so that minority and women-owned businesses get their fair share of city business. Number 2, the city procures over $2 billion a year in goods and services. We need to make sure that the people who we're contracting with share our values, meaning do they care about supplier diversity? Are they also trying to build wealth in Black and brown neighborhoods? Number 3, the city has to use its resources and the bully pulpit of the mayor's office to go to banks and other financial lenders and lower the barriers for entrepreneurs to get access to capital.
Thank you very much. Mr. McCarthy.
Let's face it, we're not just losing people, but we're losing business because of gun violence and high taxes. Those are the 2 reasons why people are leaving Chicago. I've already outlined a number of ways that we can work in communities to spur some economic development, the proper use of TIF funding, vocational schools, giving tax incentives for small businesses to go there. I do not agree with the mayor's offering, but what I will tell you is TIF funding is really something that needs incredible look at, because it's supposed to be an economic stimulus. It's not being used for the purposes that it was created. It's being used against state law. And the fact is, we have to reform that system. We have to pay attention to the neighborhoods just as much as we pay attention to downtown. We can hold on to downtown and develop the neighborhoods at the same time. That's got to be a cultural focus of city government.
Thank you, Ms. Mendoza.
Thank you. Number one, I absolutely believe that clawbacks are in order whenever businesses do not meet their obligations of what their commitment was to the city in developing their businesses. The city absolutely needs to do a better job of creating a plan for investing in small business growth. It is the backbone of any economy. Certainly, small businesses are the greatest job providers here, not just in Chicago, but in Illinois. We need to incentivize a workforce development program that will allow for people in some of our most hardest hit neighborhoods to get the skills that they need to actually have a really robust workforce ready for any either small business or big box business that chooses to come into these neighborhoods. And we need to create access to capital for any small entrepreneur who frankly has the hardest time accessing capital and who would invest in the very neighborhoods that don't feel like neighborhoods because they don't have grocery stores, they don't have little mom and pop businesses, because they have a massive obstacle to entry.
Thank you, Ms. Perkwinkle.
I think we have to acknowledge the role that racism plays in the difficulties we have developing in black and brown neighborhoods. When I was alderman, we were trying to expand a shopping center, and we had a very hard time attracting national retailers. And the University of Chicago, which owned the shopping center, basically gave away space to the Office Depot that relocated or located in that space to encourage them to come. And it for a long time was the highest performing Office Depot in the region, because there were no Office Depots on the south side of Chicago. So I think we have to understand that racism has a real impact on the ability of black and brown communities to attract and retain national retailers. We have to have balanced development. We've focused a lot on downtown, and downtown is the economic engine for our region, but we also have to invest in our neighborhoods, and particularly we have to support small businesses in our neighborhoods. We have to figure out how the city can work with entrepreneurs and not be an obstacle to small business success. We have to help entrepreneurs build and sustain their businesses.
Thank you, Mr. Vallis.
So let me double down on this again. You need a capital infusion on the west side and the south side. You do it by taking advantage of the opportunity zones, and you take that by creating a Chicago Equity Investment Fund. So you take a third of the TIF revenues over the next 5 years, $1 billion, and you invest them in these areas. $2 billion in equity will allow you to raise $10 billion in capital. And when I say equity investment, if the city has a share in the investment and they're going to get a return, then they have some decisions on when these businesses close. Secondly, $20 billion the city controls. It's contracts, it's hiring, it's commodities. You provide the type of weighting that I provided when I ran the Chicago Public Schools with the school construction dollars, and you apply that to the airport, you apply that to CHA, you apply that to the CTA, et cetera, and you will be able to provide the type of incentives for businesses to locate in these areas, because they know that they're going to get points when it comes to applying for these contracts and for these services.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson.
Well, I think it's very simple. Why do we got to go outside and try to raise money when the African American community, Latino community, and other community pay taxes, and other people take the tax and put it outside the community? It ain't about running outside trying to find the money. The money is already here. Mayor of the City of Chicago can direct those dollars to make sure it reflects each community that is served. Those are taxpayers' dollars that are entitled to go back into the community. So Ron Emanuel have, disgrace to Chicago, as far as I'm concerned, because he got this city in the situation is today. He ran them out. He ran business out. You got to lower these taxes to attract new business to come into the city. And the other politicians here don't even say nothing about it.
Thank you. Ms. Brown.
Well, this of course, people are leaving the city of Chicago because of gentrification. Gentrification should not equal displacement, also because of the schools and the crime and the lack of economic development. In my business and in my economic development plan, I talk about these planning districts, and within that, I want to create the economic development plan and then attract the developers to actually implement the plan. And within that, I also talk about making sure that we have small businesses. I have a small business technology assistant platform that's within my plan, and I'm going to make sure that we provide small businesses with the kind of assistance. Let them know about how to start a small business. Let them know about how to find legal services, pro bono legal services and accounting services. Let them know about small business administration grants, because many people don't even know that they can have that and know where banks are that will give them funding.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chico?
It's a crying shame that our people are leaving the city. We're losing who we are, but it doesn't have to be that way. People leave for a lot of reasons: crime, education, and unaffordability. And we, some of us on the stage, tax our people out of this city. Whether it's soda, real estate, income, parking, you name it, I want to stop that. I'm fighting for the working families of the city to stay here. We can also find the resources to rebuild our neighborhood strips. But before I get there, I stood with Bobby Rush to protest the closures of Target. And I feel the same way about Marshalls. They want it when it suits them, and they want to get up and leave when it's convenient for them to leave. We can't allow that to happen. But we can't rely on them alone. We have to rebuild our neighborhood commercial streets. I was out on 79th Street not long ago. We were all at the UIC Forum last Saturday, and we saw very specific ways to rebuild our community and our neighborhood strip centers. We can do that. The money's there. We just have to focus on it.
Thank you. And Mr. Daly?
No doubt about it. We have to reform the TIF. I announced immediately after Target announced they were leaving the South Side that the TIF benefit being given to the developer in Lincoln Square for Target should be taken away by the City Council. They didn't act. That is important as a message. Who knows the future of retail? We've spent too much focus on big box and other things in retail space. That's changing dramatically. We've got to understand that. We've got to get more manufacturing, and I'm going to lay out a plan very shortly on making Chicago the hub of advanced manufacturing in America. That has to be done. So we've got to make the changes in TIF. We've got to look how to get private investment in neighborhoods throughout this city. But the most important thing we can do is make this city more inclusive, and wherever the jobs are, we have to make sure that the people in every neighborhood in this city can take advantage of those jobs, that they have the education and the training. That's why I propose joining CPS and junior colleges together so that the young men and women who leave after 14 years would be prepared for the jobs of the future.
Thank you. So the question, and Ms. Preckwinkle kind of touched on this, the question really was, and gets to the heart of racism. You said racism was part of the problem of getting, that there's a lack of investment on the South and West Side. How do you confront that racism? Because it's not about how much money or how many TIFs you give or any breaks or any of that or any incentives. It's about how do you change the racism and the attitudes about the South and West Side that would prevent people from investing in them. So anyone can answer that question. That's my follow. Okay. How do you address it?
Well, I think it's. I already talked about the fact that it starts with the articulation and the recognition of how we got here, and that's racism. So that conversation needs to be had, and it's a very uncomfortable conversation that people don't like to have. We need to talk about race. We have to stop the polarization. We have to have exposure, which is something that we actually structurally don't do. One of the things that I used to talk about frequently was the fact that we want black and brown and Hispanic officers in neighborhoods that are black and brown and Hispanic. That's preventing us from having exposure. I put the first white commander in Englewood since the early 60s, and when I put him there were protests. And when I took him out, there were protests also because they didn't want him to leave. I put the first African-American commander north of Division Street. Jimmy Jones, he's now a chief on the job. He kicked butt. We have to have that exposure. We have to go back and forth and have that conversation.
Okay, anyone else want to respond to that?
Yeah.
I'll come back to you next, Mr. Wilson,
I'd like to
and then Ms. Lightfoot.
Well, you cannot teach a person not to be racist. You just cannot teach it. It's just like a person going to try to tell me to change my religion to another religion. It ain't going to happen. But what we can do, we can make sure that we be fair in terms of economic equality, job, contract, put us all together and make sure it's fair. Then we began to know one another, communicate with one another. That's how we come together, all right? Because that way people work. So you just about forget about trying to teach somebody not to be racist. That ain't gonna happen. Make it just fair in terms of equality and job and contracts.
Ms. Lightfoot.
I think you have to make sure that the mayor has a real comprehensive plan that includes all the neighborhoods. You know, if we're honest, right, we don't have a development plan, and we struggle to get developers to invest south of Roosevelt Road and west of Ashland. And that's because the mayor and his team don't focus on the need to bring businesses to those communities. They don't recognize the fact that there's racism. Look, you look at the city of Boston, right? The mayor there says, hey, I'll pick on Walgreens. Hey, Walgreens, you want to invest in the most lucrative areas in our neighborhood? Well, I've got this need over here. And you use the pulpit of the mayor's office with a real vision and plan based upon conversations with the neighborhood about what their needs are, and you do not let the developers and the national change be the tail that wags the dog. You must lead. That's the way to crack this problem.
Thank you, Ms. Ingham.
The problem with racism is that it is institutionalized practices and policies that are very intentional. And so with that same intentionality, you have to direct private investment and public investment into neighborhoods that have been disinvested because of the ethnic makeup of those neighborhoods. So when I talk about direct investment, it is because the stated philosophy of the Department of Planning was to invest primarily in the central business district at the expense of the neighborhoods. This was explicit policy. So with that same intentionality, you have to direct investment to those neighborhoods. Private investment actually follows the lead of public investment. So when the mayor leads on this issue, private investment then follows. The other thing is when we talk about access and wealth building, I've noticed that in developer conversations, we do not address expanding the pipelines to access to contracting opportunities with the city. We have been okay with having minority contractors in subcontracting positions, but where are they in prime contracting positions where they are the ones that are hiring and actually building wealth from the top down? Those kinds of conversations need to happen as well.
And Ms. Perkwinkle.
Well, it's important to acknowledge problems in order to address them. And we don't talk enough in this country about race and about the impact over time of racism. You know, if you look at investments in the city, we should be looking carefully at black and brown communities to be sure that the same investments are being made in them as in more privileged white communities. And those are infrastructure investments, investments in our schools, particularly, again, our neighborhood schools, to be sure that they're properly resourced, our parks. I mean, we all are aware that the Park District, for example, was sued around the way in which it allocated resources, and it was clear that there was discrimination. We have a history in the city of Chicago of redlining, of locating our highways to preserve segregation. There's a long list of ways in which race has been used to disempower and to challenge black and brown neighborhoods. And the mayor of the city of Chicago has to focus on equity and on fairness and trying to be sure that black and brown communities are treated fairly and get the resources they need to prosper.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Vallis, I'm going to come over that way. Okay. Mr. Vallis
Okay,
first.
thank you. Well, look, first of all, you know, we have communities that haven't seen significant investment in 4 decades. And we have many people, you know, here and running who have been witnesses to that, if not a party to that. I mean, we have areas that have been in a depression state for 4 decades, generational poverty. And I've said over and over again, what we've got to do is these communities need capital investment. Look, the decision to do a TIF, a $1 billion TIF on the north side, you know, with Lincoln Yards, and the decision to put a scrap iron yard in the 10th Ward and to move the polluted fleet management garage to Englewood. I mean, those are decisions that are being made from the top. That's not community-driven. That is City Hall-driven. So we've got to prioritize, and I've articulated some ways to do that, investments in the community, because that's the only way we're going to change attitude. It begins with the city's leaders. It begins with the city's political establishment.
Thank you. I said I was coming over this way, so Dorothy Brown, and then Mr. Chico.
So, Mary,
Mr. Daly, you want to chime in too? Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You first.
It starts at the top. So it starts at the top with the mayor, and it also has a lot to do with the diversity of the employees within the city of Chicago. and especially the cabinet of the mayor. So I'm going to make sure that my cabinet actually reflects the city of Chicago and its diversity, and that my people know that they must recognize the importance of all communities, especially the black and brown communities. Now, I have an urban policy plan that will prioritize the west side and the south side of the city of Chicago, because those are the neighborhoods that have been disinvested in the most. And so that's one of the things that I'm going to make sure that I do, and to prioritize the TIF funding, because it's supposed to go to the blighted areas already anyway. And then, of course, the federal opportunity zones, which are really on those sides of town, the 133 federal opportunity zones.
Okay. Mr. Chico?
I don't think there's any magic wand that's going to erase racism overnight. I think it's a lifetime job. We have to be on guard every day to look for its signs. We have to confront it heavily, which is why I stood with Congressman Rush. I thought it was important to make a stand and send a message. You can't just treat us like this by pulling up and walking out. But I think I'm optimistic at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
I've been a part of projects that change things. I mentioned North Lawndale a little while ago. I've worked with utilities to build service centers on the west side of Chicago, 95th and Stony to build a commercial center. There are good developers in this city who want to do good, but you have to have a leader at the top who is going to persistently bring these actions into neighborhoods so that we can actually change things and just stop talking about them.
Thank you. And Mr. Daly.
No question. It starts at the top. The mayor has to set the tone that he's going to be fair to every community in this city. That's the sort of leadership I want to provide. The city can invest so much capital, and we've thrown numbers around all over the place, but the fact is, in many neighborhoods, it is the private sector that will make the difference, not the government. The government could put some seed money in. You look at the program Sam Scott's running, Black Chicago Tomorrow, in Gresham and Inglewood. That is private sector money that he's trying to gather from the major companies in this city to invest in that community and make a serious difference. That's leadership, and that's the sort of leadership I want to do with the city of Chicago.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to turn it over now to Mr. You want to weigh in on that? Okay,
Yes,
thank you.
I do. I think it's very important. I think we do need to acknowledge that race permeates everything in this city. Black and brown communities have been victimized, frankly, by disinvestment for many, many years. I think that it's important to call it out when we see it, and whether that's Target or any other institution. And there's a thought that Chicago, because it's the most segregated city, is this beautiful mosaic of different patchworks and quilts. That's absurd, because if you dig deep, if you had a microscope and you could look deep into any one of those little patches, which from a distance might look nice, if you live in one of those and your patch doesn't have a grocery store or a good school or safe streets that you can walk, it's a pretty terrible looking patch on that quilt. Now, having said that, the biggest, I think, factor or demonstration of racism in the city is the achievement gap that we have in our kids' schools. And let's just be honest, white children are not born any smarter than black or brown kids. Yet somehow down the line,
thank you,
we see a massive achievement gap that is a recipe for a lack of success. That needs to change.
We need to wrap up. I'm going to turn it over to Eric.
Thank you. My next question relates to the problem of race that we have been discussing, but it involves transportation. The CTA Red Line Extension Project has been promised to residents on the far south side for decades. Many promises have been given, many excuses have been made. The CTA several years ago approved $75 million for the project, but that is far short of the $1 billion that's needed to build 4 new rail stations and extend the line to 130th Street, where there is little to no public transportation. As mayoral candidates for Chicago, what are your plans to secure funding for this much-needed and much-delayed project?
We'd like to start with Ms. Lightfoot.
Well, look, I think we have to think about the extension has to happen. Those neighborhoods are cut off from public transit, and that has a ripple effect on all sorts of things related to economic development. But I also think we have to look at whether or not there's a better way to achieve it. One of the alternatives that doesn't get a lot of discussion is partnering with Metra. Metra travels along those same lines, and if we look at that, frankly, it's a cheaper way, a faster way to get services to those neighborhoods without the $1 billion price tag. So I think we've got to think creatively about it. Look, in the world of Trump, we're not going to get a lot of help and really the dollars come from federal dollars. So we've got to look at the resources that are there. We've got to, I think, go to the RTA board and think about ways that we can partner with the RTA to solve some of these problems, because I don't think we're going to get there on our own without doing that.
Thank you. Ms. Inya.
So part of the challenge is making sure that we appropriately prioritize our transit projects to make sure that we're addressing the equity issue. So we cannot talk about not being able to expand the Red Line down to 130th while we're also talking about a bullet train from O'Hare to downtown, or where we're talking about a flyover to save Northside residents a few seconds on their commute time. So I think fundamentally the prioritization of where individuals have access to transit has to be done. We also have to make sure that we're lobbying the state. We do need a capital bill at the state level to have transportation dollars allocated to the city of Chicago. And I don't think that we forfeit engaging with the president to make sure that we get the resources that we are entitled to as a city. I don't think we should be precluded from access to transportation dollars for the much needed transit equity issues that we have in the city. And we should pull every lever that we have at our disposal to do so.
Thank you. Mr. Daly.
No doubt the extension that you speak of, which is $1 billion, the vast majority has to come from the federal government, as Lori said. Until there's a change of the federal administration, it's pretty unrealistic to think that that they're going to fund this city, considering his opinion of our city. I was proud to work for President Obama as his chief of staff, so I understand the power of the presidency if he wants to help you. If he doesn't want to help you, the chance to get that money is pretty slim, in spite of the fact that we have a Democratic House. But I think Lori's idea, to be frank with you, working with Metro to try to have a short-term solution to the problem for the people out to 130th Street. But I would say the most important thing you could do is make a change in 2020 with the leadership of our country.
Mr. Chico.
Here, here.
There's no doubt about it. This is a critical project, and I'm glad that the CTA came up with the money for the preliminary planning and engineering for the project. But you're right, there is a very large price tag to finishing it. I think it's vital for the south side of Chicago, for the residents to have the economic impact that typically comes from rail projects, but we already have a model. Some people have wanted to get rid of TIFs entirely. I want to reform TIFs, but I want to keep the essential good elements of them. The Red Purple Line project in Chicago is half TIF, half federal money. We can use TIF again on the south side, right along the rail line, along with capital monies. We're going to have a very large state capital program. We'll see if we can. I think I'm with Amara on this. I don't think you write off the federal government yet. We're still part of the United States the last time I looked. And we ought not forfeit our right to get money out of this administration. We should make that project a reality. It's very doable.
Thank you. Ms. Brown.
You know, about 27% of the people in those neighborhoods are unemployed, and about 44% live below the poverty line. So that the transportation issue is having a direct effect on them. So I would actually create a transit TIF, similar to what we already created for the north part of the Red Line. Why can't we do that for the south part of the Red Line? That goes to the race issue that you talked about, Eric. And I want to make sure that we work with the General Assembly in Springfield to look at capital funding and the Federal Transportation Administration. Yes, we are a part of the United States, and we definitely should work with the Federal Transportation Administration to get better capital funding and really get rid of this president the next time.
Thank you. Mr. McCarthy.
I believe that transportation equals opportunity in this conversation that we're talking about. People need access to methods to get to work where they find work. And we can't tax our way out of the problems that we have in this city. We can't tax people any more than we're taxing them. We do need to pursue federal funding. And this is the polarization that I talk about. I joke about it. I say everybody I talk to in Chicago wants change. That crosses every demographic, black, white, Hispanic, Asian, yes, even Republicans too. So the polarization is not serving us. We need to stop borrowing to pay our debt. We have to stop political spending and work on needs-based spending. And for that reason, I'm going to do forensic accounting to find out where the money went. Because I think we have more of a spending problem than we do a revenue problem in this city. And needs-based spending has to be at the heart of this.
Thank you. Ms. Mendoza.
I absolutely do believe that we need to extend the CTA red line. The issue is that, again, here we're talking about race. I mean, depending on where you're at on that red line, your experience is incredibly different from south to north. Having said that, no one here knows how to navigate Springfield as well as I do. That is my sweet spot, and it's going to be an important skill set to have as the next mayor, to be able to fight to bring the appropriate dollars back from a capital plan that will be earmarked specifically for things like this. Federal dollars, we're not going to give up on that. There's no way I'm going to just take a pass on fighting for every dollar that we can bring back from Chicago. And I'm going to look forward to taking on Donald Trump when I'm the mayor of Chicago. Having said that, we need comprehensive integrated travel experiences in the city of Chicago. And we have a lot of issues with people in the west side and the south side who don't have the ability to get from their home to the bus stop or to the train stop easily. So last mile connections and what we can do to think creatively, maybe mobile scooters, things of that nature that are being tried on in other cities are a good thing that we should consider. And
Thank you. No, we got to move on.
Dedicated bike lanes.
We're winding
and
down.
bus
We're
lanes.
winding
Sorry.
down. Ms. Preckwinkle.
There's so much to talk about.
Access to public transit is critical to the vitality of our neighborhoods. You know, if you live in a community that's not well served by public transit, you can't get to work, you can't get to school, you can't get to your shopping destinations. So that's absolutely critical. And many parts of our city, particularly on the south side, do not have good access to public transit. I agree that we have to look at the Metro Electric line on the 95th to 130th. We already have the right-of-way there. It's available to us, and that Metro Electric line is underutilized. So this is a real opportunity to take advantage of an existing resource and an investment we've already made and enhance that investment in a way that serves the communities through which the line goes. We've got to work hard for a capital bill in Springfield that will include investments in public transit and, of course, for federal dollars. You know, the county had a 3-year planning process. We put together a long-range transportation plan, and we shifted from a focus on roads and bridges to a multimodal plan that included transit, bikes, and freight.
Thank you. Mr. Vallis.
Look, we need to try to get federal funding for the red line extension, and I'm not a novice at federal negotiations, having played a role in negotiating the $2 billion FEMA settlement, which rebuilt the New Orleans schools. Secondly, we need to focus on the upgrading of the services we have. That means the Metro Electric line. That means general bus services to frequency, station and depot upgrades. How about installing heaters? That's also about security, and it's also about fair subsidies, because, again, students were telling me at Whitney Young the other day that on weekends they don't get those fair breaks, so they can't come to school on the weekend. So those things are critically important. And finally, we need to have a transit agenda for Springfield. They're going to roll out this big capital bill, and having spent, because this is my sweet spot too, 12 years in Springfield as really the policy person for the Illinois Democratic Senate, I know a little something about transportation, and I know a little something about how those capital bills, if you lobby, you can get transportation subsidies.
Thank you. Mr.
CTA.
Wilson.
Well, to me, this is simple. Lower fare, increase ridership. Lower fare, increase ridership. A lot of people ask me why I give people money in the street. Christmas, Thanksgiving. They want to buy turkeys. But how can you give a person money to buy a turkey when they don't have a stove to cook it on? It's tough out there, okay? If it's that tough out there, a person cannot ride these high fare, these buses. You got to lower the price to increase ridership. If you do not do that, nobody's going to ride the bus or the L.
All right, thank you. Mr. Blakely.
So I'd like to pose a question that actually isn't on our question list, but it's topical. It's kind of a follow-up. We sit here on the eve of the Jason Van Dyke, Laquan McDonald verdict. And today we saw the acquittal of 3 Chicago police supervisors accused in a cover-up of the Laquan McDonald killing. So a two-part question. First, was today's verdict an act of justice, or is it a green light for continuation of the code of silence? That's part one. Part two, how can we forge a path to a police department where officers and supervisors are willing to call out improper actions by those they supervise and those they work with, as opposed to defending them right or wrong?
That question starts with you, Mr. McCarthy.
Ironic. So first of all, I think that the same thing that I said about the Van Dyke conviction, I say about this. The system has spoken. Let's be frank. The criminal justice system here in Cook County does not work. We have violent criminals walking our streets every single day, and we need criminal justice reform. We need to do a number of things to make that happen. I do not see this as a green light because everybody also saw the fact that Jason Van Dyke just got convicted. What happens with that sentencing? I think he's going to get significant time in jail. You know, we have to rely on this system until we change it. I don't see anything other than that as far as the structure of the criminal justice system is concerned. As far as creating a department that is willing to discipline itself, if you will, as far as calling people out, it's a cultural issue here in Chicago. When I was asked, what do we need to do to reduce crime?
We need to move on. Thank you.
We need to go legit.
Mr. Wilson.
Well, we got more problem than just discrimination within the police department. And I'll be remiss if I didn't say this. But, you know, another side community that is discriminated against, and that is the LGBTQIA. That is a serious situation. Need to be looked into it as well. And we need to follow the laws, enforce the laws, making sure these things are taken care of. So I want to say that much, and I also want to say it to some of my friends who are watching this tonight in the religion community. We got to take a different look at this whole situation and change our mind that all human beings treated equally and fairly.
Mr. Vallis.
Look, I said from the beginning, well, first of all, I don't think it's a green light, and I've said from the beginning that you need to let the criminal justice system take its course. But I will tell you this. You see it, obviously, the most recent indictments notwithstanding or the most recent charges regarding Alderman Burke notwithstanding, the big fish never get caught. You know, the aldermen go to jail, the poor aldermen go to jail, the cops in the field, they're the ones who, get brought to trial. But the individuals who are involved in the cover-up, the individuals who really create a code of silence from the top down, because I don't believe that there's a code of silence. I just think that there's been an egregious lack of leadership. I think that's where it begins, because they always seem to get off the hook. And so, at the end of the day, until we start going after the big fish, and until we start holding those responsible who are in a position of responsibility, I don't think we're ever going to get the justice we deserve.
We're quickly running out of time, and this is an important question, so that we really need to get through it by everybody adhering to the time. Okay, Ms. Preckwinkle?
I was heartened by the fact that Jason Van Dyke was found guilty. But you have to understand that he's the first police officer in 50 years who's been found guilty of murdering one of our residents, and he's surely not the first police officer in 50 years who murdered one of our residents. Unfortunately, I think this is a step backward. The message it sends is that basically it's okay for officers to cover up for each other and to lie. We need an Office of Criminal Justice in the mayor's office that's going to focus on bringing the stakeholders together around reform, that will bring grants to communities around violence prevention, anti-recidivism, restorative justice, and focus on policy initiatives. We need to implement the consent decree, as I said earlier, to provide more professionalization for our police officers and better supervision on the street. And we have to hold our police department accountable. We have a horrible closure rate for murders. In the nation, the average is 62 to 63%. In the city of Chicago, it's less than 20.
Thank you. Ms. Mendoza.
I mean, obviously, while this verdict, I feel personally, is very disappointing and disheartening, the crazy part about it is that it's not surprising. We've seen this happen over and over again, not just in Chicago, but across the country. And frankly, if we're trying to heal the divisions that exist today, a verdict like this just doesn't move us in the right direction. It continues to pour salt on an open wound. It is the law. The verdict, it stands. But it sends a message that, frankly, people feel very strongly about the fact that there was not the truth was not told necessarily on these reports. And while a judge may feel differently, I think the people who are going to be part and parcel of an equation of solving this horrible toxic culture that exists right now between the police and the community are not feeling empowered today. We can't give up. We have to keep moving forward. And this is going to be one of the toughest jobs for the next mayor of Chicago to do.
Ms. Lightfoot.
Well, today's verdict was a disappointment, but not a surprise. You look at the history of what happens with police officers who are charged with crimes in 26th Street, not a surprise. I'm hoping, though, that, frankly, the superintendent immediately brings charges against the one officer who remains on the job. This police board has to reopen its cases that are pending against the other officers who are involved. The U.S. Attorney's Office should open up a grand jury investigation and look at criminal charges. How do we forge a path towards truth-telling? We enforce the rules that exist. Rule 14 is a general order that's been on the books for a long time, and in essence it says, you lie, you die. If you lie in the course of an internal investigation or in the course of your job, you lose your job, and you have to enforce that. I have a record of doing that both when I was at OPS and certainly on the police board. We have to continue the hard work of changing the culture. The culture lies at the sergeant's level. We've got to pick better sergeants. We've got to train them properly, but we got to hold them accountable so that, as Paul said and others have said, that the line officers don't bear the weight of this, that the supervisors have to be accountable for the conduct that's going on in the department.
So we started this forum asking about community oversight and whether input was necessary, and the decision today is the reason why. If we are going to have a department that has the legitimacy in the eyes of the public, decisions like this only further erode that legitimacy. It seems that we took one step forward with the verdict in the Jason Van Dyke trial, and this time it seems we've taken a step back. Changing the culture of the department means calling out things as they are. It means that we cannot reward bad behavior or tacitly accept that behavior. Within the department, what stuck out to me from today's decision is what happens to the police officer that spoke out, who talked about not getting backed up because of what she did, because of the information that she shared, who feels threatened or in jeopardy because of being on the right side of an issue. That is something that has to be taken care of within the department. And if we don't do that, if the police department doesn't lead on that, it will continue to erode its legitimacy in the eyes of the public that it hopes to gain trust.
Thank you, Mr. Daly.
It is obviously rather difficult to understand when you had the conviction of Officer Van Dyke and then this decision. We have to accept it. We have to try to move on. In addition to that question you asked, Derek, whether or not there's a code of silence in the police department. There is. There is a code of silence. There has been a code of silence in the Catholic Church over abuse. Code of silence in the school system over abuse of young people. We've seen that. There's been a code of silence in the business community on all sorts of issues over time. So they all have to be addressed. And I'd say even in your business, there's a code of silence at times. So we have to acknowledge it, and we have to have leadership that acknowledges it, understands it, and moves on. The next leadership of the police department's got to understand that things have to change. I do believe, not only with the consent decree, but with the things we've learned from this debacle and this tragedy, this department will be better and the city will be better off.
Thank you. Mr. Chico.
Today's decision in no way furthered justice. I was disappointed in the decision. I think we all saw what happened on the video. We all saw the reports of those police officers that were prosecuted and what they were prosecuted for. It just doesn't square up. Nobody understands it's going to be a really tough decision to swallow. But I think the way you also asked Eric about how do you change things. You need a new leader in the police department. Part of the reason that I called for Eddie Johnson's removal is he has had a record of promoting officers who have been the subjects of abuse, of deadly force. He's promoted them. This is not going to make things better. It's only going to reinforce a code of silence. We need new leadership, and we need it quickly. We can restore trust, but it's going to take a leader who models behavior and brings it to a cultural level within the department.
Thank you. And Dorothy Brown.
You know, today's decision was very disappointing to me. But I think that we moved from a green light to a yellow light, at least, just because of the fact that these individuals were brought to court. And just by the fact that Jason Van Dyke was found guilty, of course, I can't comment on that because I keep his record and he could appeal that case. But from the standpoint of the 3 police officers, and that case can't be appealed, I think it was very disappointing. I think that we have to work with the FOP. We have to deal with the negotiation of the next contract to take away the weaknesses in there. And we also have to make sure that the complaints, all of the complaints, 30,000 complaints came in, but only 2% clearance. We have to make sure that all of the complaints is zero tolerance. We have to investigate all of them and make sure that they are being properly investigated. And when there's discipline, there should be discipline.
Thank you very much, candidates. It has been the fastest hour and a half that I have. You know, it's been great. It's been great. But thank you so much for coming in and for sharing your thoughts and your ideas and your plans and why you should be the next mayor of the city of Chicago.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Mary, our deepest thanks to you. You ran a tight ship,
No,
and you kept
they're
things
taping.
moving. We thank you. We couldn't have done it in an hour and a half without your diligence. Panelists, we thank you. Those were insightful questions, and you went to the heart of the issues that matter to the Black and brown community. Candidates, thank you. It doesn't matter if we hold a forum and you don't show up. So we thank you for coming to share your perspectives with Chicago's Black and brown communities. Thank you, and good night. There are still some media that might want to grab you as you're walking out, just to alert you to that.